I'll just give an overview of kind of where we are and happy to take questions after that. As was mentioned, and as I'm sure most, if not all of you already know, about a year ago, the city began a process for an alternative fuel study for CAT's transportation fleet. This is being conducted in order to make a recommendation ultimately to City Council about both what types of vehicles CAT will purchase when they cycle through outdated vehicles, as well as what the actual timeline is going to be for transitioning the fleet to zero emissions. As was mentioned, this is happening on a faster timeline than I had anticipated, but last night we got an interim presentation that is probably pretty close, I would imagine, to the consultant's final report to City Council. And we were told last night that between 30 and 90 days is their timeline for coming back to council and making a recommendation for us. The decision is fully within City Council's control. Whatever the consultant does or does not recommend does not lock us into doing anything, but it will certainly increase the probability that, councilors are more likely to go with a recommendation than not, although nothing about that is guaranteed. I guess to distill down after last night's presentation, I think the policy issue at hand is City Council is going to have a choice within the next 1 to 3 months about whether the fleet converts to compressed natural gas vehicles or battery electric buses. There were, in the report, there was other information about hydrogen, renewable natural gas, but particularly on the timeline they're talking about for the first transition, I think the real relevant ones are compressed natural gas or battery electric vehicles with fast charging infrastructure that's installed. The importance of this issue is that whatever decision is made under the regulations from the federal government, the city will need to use the buses we purchase for either 12 years or I think 500,000 miles, whichever is longest. And for our existing fleet, that means that each bus we purchase has a lifetime of around 15 years or so. And the federal government will not reimburse until that is met. So in effect, whatever decision we make is going to be locked in for probably about 15 years. The relevant concern being, if the city makes a decision to convert to compressed natural gas as our first step, and then by 2050 would convert to battery electric vehicles, that's going to guarantee that the city is delayed from transitioning to battery electric buses for about 15 years, which obviously has enormous climate and policy implications. At last night's meeting, the perspective voiced by Councilor Pinkston, this is my perspective as well, is that the correct choice is to transition to battery electric vehicles with fast charging infrastructure that's installed. I don't know where the 3 other councilors sit in terms of where they're going to ultimately come out on their decision. And so it's pretty much a sprint between now and on the shortest timeline, about a month from now, longest 3 months from now, of trying to present the strongest case possible that the city choosing battery electric buses with fast charging infrastructure is not only feasible, it is clearly the best option from an emissions perspective, and that the concerns about reliability are able to be addressed. The counter argument, just trying to give the other side the strongest possible argument for individuals who may want to see conversion to compressed natural gas, is their concern is around, they say, well, the battery electric vehicles aren't reliable, even with fast charging infrastructure. And if we do that, we don't know if that means the system will have more buses that break down, that require greater maintenance. They're not able to do their routes on time. There's a higher number of hours that a bus is just unusable, and that therefore compressed natural gas is the way to go because we don't have any concerns about the reliability of that technology, and we view it as less experimental. That was the concern raised by other councilors. And I think the most important thing in the next 1 to 3 months is both building a coalition that's reaching out to City Council and letting all of us know that this is a very important policy decision, and we believe that from both a climate perspective and even just the reliability and health of the transit system, that switching to battery electric vehicles, again, with fast charging infrastructure, is the correct choice, but also being able to provide a really strong factual argument for why battery electric vehicles or battery electric buses are reliable. The technology is usable, workable, and that the concern about reliability that may lead you to choose compressed natural gas buses instead is not accurate, or there are ways to address that concern. And of course, the other variable here that is also really important is not only the path dependency of being locked into our decision for about 15 years, there's also federal money through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. And obviously that money is not going to be around forever. It is likely, it could easily be a couple decades before we see that amount of federal money available for a locality to make that transition. And depending on the decision we make, I'm worried that we may kind of foreclose our opportunity to access that federal money. Again, if you're talking about delaying your transition by 15 years, I would find it extraordinarily unlikely much of any of that money is going to be left after 15 years. So that's kind of the situation. And again, I think the most critical thing at this point is trying to, as fast as possible, build a coalition that's reaching out and communicating to the city council more than anybody, because we're going to be the ultimate decision makers. And again, being able to also communicate why that concern about reliability should not be a relevant concern and consideration for council in our decision making. So that's kind of it. That's all I had prepared. I'm really happy to answer any questions or just kind of have a more informal, free-flowing conversation about where we're at and where we may go from here.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Bruce Glasgow, let me ask a little coordination. I'm happy to moderate some Q&A here, or did you envision that you might do that, or Bruce, did you want to?
I'm happy to have you moderate.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just, I think maybe if people have questions from Michael, maybe you could moderate, and then if we wanted to sort of transition into a discussion of sort of tactics and how we can sort of muster our energy, our manpower over the next couple of months into coming up with maybe a couple of different prongs of a campaign. I've put some things in the sign-in sheet, and maybe I can sort of take over when we're ready to do that.
Okay, so why don't I'll moderate a few minutes of Q&A for Michael, and then Bruce, I'll have you on tap there to lead us through a little bit of thought process on organizing. I see one or a couple hands raised, and we had a question already in the chat. In the chat, Carol asked, did the consultants have any relevant information, hard data about problems with reliability? And this is presumably reliability of battery electric buses.
In terms of what we were presented last night, there was not really hard data. I think the things we were presented with were, one, there is a scenario where we convert to all battery electric buses without fast charging infrastructure. And their analysis that you would need about a 1.6 to 1 bus replacement ratio, which would have, enormous financial implications, as well as just having the physical space to store that buses. But then they also added in a scenario with fast charging infrastructure, which takes that pretty close to 1-to-1 and is the actual realistic scenario. I think converting to a fleet of all electric buses without the fast charging infrastructure is kind of not particularly serious as a policy option. The other thing they presented us a chart about the length that electric buses are able to go on routes. And then they overlaid that over the length of our existing routes. And they had a maximum range of 240 miles. And then they said, looking at industry data of existing buses, we have, we see that in practice, they're going, I think about like 50% of that stated maximum range, and the lowest like 40 or 30%. And then they showed under those most pessimistic assumptions that about half of our routes would work with that, but about half of the rest would be a greater range than works. The problem is, even later on in their presentation, they showed that what is currently available technology, the maximum range is 350 miles and above, not 240. And if you apply even their pessimistic assumptions to that maximum range of the existing technology, all of our existing routes fit within that technology. So that, and then the response they gave to that question was, they said, well, yes, that technology is existing for that 350 mile plus range, but not every company is providing that right now. So we didn't feel comfortable including that maximum range. So that is the extent of the information they provided.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bob, I think you were next in line. Bob McAdams with a hand raised and question.
Yes, this is one of my concerns. If we're looking at this decision through the lens of the climate action plan that the city adopted, with a goal of reaching 45% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. I think that using methane, because natural gas is kind of a euphemistic way of describing it, using methane has to be considered in terms of the extraction of the methane, the transmission through pipelines, the loss in storage, the loss in transfer to vehicles, all of that in the light of methane being, I've read, 40 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And if you take all of that into consideration, that start to finish look at the effect on greenhouse gas emissions and effect on the climate crisis, that would have to weigh into the decision relative to whether to go to electric buses or to CNG.
Correct. And just, I think, one of the things in the study that was difficult is they included information about renewable natural gas, and they made some assumptions that I didn't see backed up with any hard data that, again, as a non-expert, just seemed very fanciful to me. They actually showed the RNG having negative emissions over time and being better for the climate than battery electric buses. And that is an important point to debunk in terms of that's not going to be a realistic option for us. And I think, again, distilling it down, the real policy choice in front of council is compressed natural gas and battery electric vehicles or buses, to highlight that difference, that in terms of emissions from the buses themselves and any impact on the climate, the only option that we're actually ever going to make at this point is between CNG, battery electric buses, and CNG is going to have no impact on that side of it. And to kind of distill it down into that is kind of the cost benefit analysis for us as council. Because I think some of what we presented as in terms of green hydrogen, renewable natural gas, almost just kind of confuses the conversation even more for council. But
okay, let's keep going here. Tom, Olivier, you have your hand raised.
Well, actually, my question was asked of what data that they presented on the reliability of electric vehicles.
Okay, great. Let's keep
We
going.
have one. We've
Sorry.
driven one for 40,000 miles and haven't had any trouble. So I'll just say that.
Yeah. Joni, let's keep going. You have your hand raised.
Hey, I'm just wondering, Michael, you've seen the grannies in front of the council. If we made up a song addressing the issue and went around town singing this and coming to the council and singing it and possibly getting on the news, would that be of help?
I would think yes. I think anything that can raise public awareness is helpful. I think, quite frankly, outside of some environmental activists who follow local government closely, I don't think there's much of any public awareness that this decision is coming, or the background or implications of the decision.
So then my, what I would love to do is either meet with you or Cville 350, get exactly the right bullet points that should be in that song, and we'll go for it.
Sure, and I'd be happy to meet and do so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna, when we're finished talking to, or asking questions to Michael, I agree. I think that I'm really hoping we can get the grannies, putting this message forward. So yeah, but go ahead with other people with
Yeah.
questions from
We
Michael
got,
about the.
I think we have a few minutes here. We can extend and have a couple more questions. Bill Espinoza, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I had two questions, Michael. One is about the county that I know puts up some money for all of this. What's the best form for us to seek county participation in this decision? Or would that not be helpful?
At the end of the day, I mean, I think this is really going to be city council's decision. I don't think that the board of supervisors will have much influence. It couldn't hurt. I mean, I think emailing the board of supervisors, and if there's any upcoming board of supervisors meetings between now and when council would make a decision and raising that issue to them, certainly couldn't hurt. But I don't know how much of any influence they'll have on the decision city council ultimately makes.
My thanks. My second question is, in this discussion, what the consultants are doing is the assumption we're going to be working with the very large buses and not looking at options for other size buses.
That's correct. Their assumption is that we would have fixed routes and have a similar system to the one we have now, where there is not a kind of on-demand worked within the system or non-CDL buses.
Please, can I please speak for a minute?
Sure. Sorry, didn't see your hand raised. Marcia, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I can't find the hand raise button on my display. I was just
Okay.
flashing it. Anyway, we have Matthew Carter from Impact with us tonight. Just to know, and we have a CCAN staffer, Mason Manley, and we may have, so this coalition might look more like the, and C3 is joining us, glory hallelujah. So the coalition may look more like the community than a few special interest environmentalists. This is a good thing. Secondly, the actual paperwork that the consultants are planning is to is to get 22 or so more diesel buses. And when their lifespan is fulfilled, then start converting to either CNG or battery electric. So things are worse than, even worse than we've been saying so far, in terms of diesel emissions and all of that good stuff.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
that's a real health problem. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Marcia. Mike, I've got a question for you. And this comes up some in the chat this evening, a couple of the comments, and you alluded to it yourself. As in any study report like this, the consultants have made, they've consulted materials, they've drawn on their expertise, they're making certain assumptions. But the presentation last night gave us very little insight into that underlying content for the summary presentation. To what extent will council, or to what extent will we here in the interested audience have a chance to see that under the hood, backup documentation? I mean, that was one of the things for me. I listened to the presentation last night, and there's some things I might question, but I don't really know the basis for statements that are made. And it's not just, will we all, council as well as interested parties, get a chance to see that, but how quickly do you think council's going to make a decision once they get the report?
Yeah, so to the first part, I don't know when or to what extent we'll see kind of the data and assumptions underneath what they presented us last night. You know, you can read through everything that was attached in our agenda last night, and there was an attachment beyond the presentation they give, but it didn't really provide any additional information. I am happy to inquire and ask for that, but I don't know when and if we'll see that information. In terms of how quickly council will make a decision, my fear is what was stated last night is the earliest recommendation is 30 to 90 days. And that my fear is if council is presented with that recommendation and at that meeting makes a final decision, because a majority of council feels as if all their questions have been answered and they feel confident enough in the recommendation that's been presented to them, and that recommendation being converting to compressed natural gas without having fully dived in as a council into the other side of that argument.
Sorry, I'm going to hog the floor with you here for just a moment, Michael.
Sure.
I'm curious. I know in some issues, I guess funding issues that come before council, there has to be like a first and second reading before I think a final vote is taken. Would that be the case here, or could the final presentation be made and in that same meeting, boom, an approval vote taken?
I'm not 100% sure, but my understanding, and I'm pretty sure this is the case, but not 100% sure, is that it could happen just at that meeting, because this wouldn't even be a formal, would be unlikely to be a formal ordinance, and it certainly wouldn't be any budget allocation. It's really kind of council giving direction to staff, which would allow it to be one reading. If it's even a reading at all. I mean, it could even be just after a discussion, council takes a straw poll of like, this is our direction to staff in the department.
So that, to me, that's fairly important, because it's not even as if there might be a 2-week between council meetings where interested parties would have a chance.
Correct.
Kind of have to come loaded for bear ahead of time.
Right. I mean, it's going to be a sprint.
Yep. Watching time, we've got maybe a couple more questions, and then I think we'll need to close off and move on in the meeting. But let's see, Peter Gates, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so did I hear correctly that part of the report will be a timeline for emissions reductions with this plan? Is that true?
For the bus fleet, yes. I mean, it because what this is ultimately going to result in is a plan that CAT submits to the federal government that is going to form their basis for grant applications and funding that they pursue. And so yes, it will also have implications. It will have implications both for what is the timeline of battery electric buses being adopted, but an even bigger, longer term, by 2050, implications for what is the timeline and types of vehicles purchased to get CAT to zero emissions.
And the city's climate action team are they playing any role in this process? Are they being allowed to play any role?
My understanding is that they have not played any substantial role. They were not part of anything in our agenda packet last night, and they were not present either to be there or to answer question at last night's meeting.
That seems like a huge oversight that can be pointed out by the public.
May I just add to that particular topic that about 1 year plus ago, when this study was being discussed, Michael, we have been raised lots of concerns that precisely that the climate team was not involved. And that's when there was a letter sent. I don't know if you remember that letter from the climate team to CAT. I don't know how I got access to that letter, recommending that CAT also considered greenhouse gas emissions in their study. And that's why yesterday Garland said, and we worked in coordination with other departments, and we actually changed our scope to actually include greenhouse gases, because originally all the study was not going to include a greenhouse gas assessment. So I just want to say I agree. The conversations they had and collaborations they had was close to nothing, but there was a little bit of effort of cross communication. I just want to mention that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, I mean, there was reference last night to emissions. And again, the concern I have is that the inclusion of renewable natural gas and hydrogen being a part of that kind of muddied the decision-making environment for council.
What exactly is renewable natural gas?
In terms of all the technical stuff, plenty of other people on here will be better able to answer it. But as my understanding, it's basically you capture the emissions from burning methane, and then you could use that as combustible gas in our bus system. I believe there's already been analysis that we wouldn't be able to do it within Rivanna Water, Waste and Sewer Authority. There's just not enough waste. So we would have to purchase it from somewhere. And there was no information presented last night about, one, the availability to purchase that, the cost of purchasing it. And my understanding is, with all those variables in play, that it's just not a particularly realistic option. But I'm sure I've butchered some of the science behind it. So anyone else, please correct.
Renewable natural gas is produced from agricultural waste for the most part. California is heavily subsidizing this market and developing it there. They have agriculture. There's also some development in the Midwest. There's nothing around here. That's it.
Sure, we could go on, but I think just watching time on our schedule, I think at this point, Bruce, if you're prepared, well, Michael, and I think everyone online this evening thanks you for your time and comments. Very helpful and informative. And so we hope we can, keep engaged with you on coordination in the next couple months on this.
Definitely. I'm happy to stick around, and I'm going to put my phone number and email in the chat. Anyone feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call at any time.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks again, Michael. Very